Now we're going to get into our first Excel demo. We're getting into Excel to build a spreadsheet that you can use to track your income and your expenses and forecast that out over time, perhaps to plan out your savings goals. I'm so excited to show this to you. It's a great example of how Excel can take certain inputs and you update those inputs and the whole rest of your model automatically updates. That's a way that Excel is particularly unique among all the analytics tools we're going to take a look at. So let's dive into Excel. All right, here we are in Excel. Hopefully you've been able to open it up, and we are in what's called an Excel workbook, and we're about to design our own personal finance workbook. Now within a workbook, there can be multiple worksheets. By default, one gets created called Sheet 1. We see that at the bottom. And if we want to rename that, we can simply right click on it and then say rename, and we'll call this one budget. Give it a good intuitive name. And as you can see at the bottom, you can create multiple sheets within a workbook, multiple worksheets within a workbook. So here's another one, and we could rename these. I don't like to have any unnecessary tabs, so I will go ahead and delete these by, again, right-clicking on it, where you can rename, or in our case, delete. And that's a worksheet in Excel. Now what you'll also notice here is we have several different tabs at the top. Home screen has a lot of your frequently accessed things like the text color and highlighting, merging cells, all kinds of things. And we'll take a look at a few of these, but you also have the option to insert pivot tables and certain types of charts on the Insert tab here, drawing, page layout. One of the things that we will turn off eventually, we'll go ahead and turn it off now, is grid lines. Now this might be controversial. Some people like to have the grid lines. It provides some structure to the worksheet, but I tend to feel like it has a cleaner look without the grid lines. So I'm going to turn off the grid lines, and that is an example of a page layout option. Just uncheck that. Now you can see all those grid lines have gone away. Some people like them, some people don't. I think it gives it a cleaner look not to have them. Formulas, data, operations, we'll see some examples of this. You can review your work, do spell check, which is important because unlike PowerPoint and Word, Excel doesn't necessarily give you the red squiggly line when something is misspelled. So it's a good idea to perhaps use spell check at a certain point. And if I maybe did fruit and I misspelled it, and then I click on spelling here, I'll say, do you want to continue at the beginning of the sheet? Yes. And it finds that and it says make some suggestions here. So it's important to use that spell check. It will not give you that red squiggly line when a word is misspelled. So we can update it from there. Just one example of review functionality. View, now you can do some really neat things here, like freezing panes, so that when you scroll, a certain column will stay at the top or a certain row will stay at the top. Lots of neat things you can do there. And then you've got a automation tab. I haven't used this much, and then a help screen too. Now, something that'll be helpful in our case, as you can see, we're a little zoomed out and it's a little hard. It'll be a little hard to read the screen. So one thing I can do, I can either use my mouse scroller for this, or in the bottom right here, we have a zoom option. I'm going to try to help you out and zoom in a little bit. There we go, that's a little better. And we can also take this formula bar here, which we'll eventually use to write formulas, and we will bring that up a little bit too, which will create some more space for us. But as we mentioned, this Excel workbook can be made up of multiple worksheets. In this case, it's one worksheet called budget, and a worksheet is a set of rows, which are based on numbers, and columns, which are identified by letters. And eventually, if you keep going and going, it starts to become 2 letters. So that's how Excel labels rows and columns. Now we can have text, we can have data tables, we can have charts, all kinds of things. And you can put multiple of these things in a single worksheet. So there's lots of layers of organization, worksheets within workbooks, and then tables and charts within a worksheet. All right, so that's your very brief Excel overview, and we'll go over a lot of other functionality as we build our own budget and our personal finance workbook. So the first thing we're going to do is we might want to have an income section where we'll keep track of our different sources of income. And it's good to just generally label things. So to start out, I am just simply going to go to a cell, and you can just click on that cell. This would be cell B2, and I can either start here, or I can just even click on the cell. I can double click on it, and then you see the cursors there. We can even just click on the cell though and just start typing, and I'm going to type some letters, the word income. Simple as that. Now for us, there will be a couple of sources of income in our example. First one would be salary. So we'll make that its own row. Now notice I skipped some space here. Whether you're in Excel or any analytics platform, use spacing strategically. Just because we're analysts doesn't mean art or intuition goes out the window. No, we want to set things up to be aesthetically pleasing, and so if spacing helps organize things, use spacing. We'll do that here. Separate the section that we're in the income section, from the actual line items within the income section. So salaries are first one, and let's say we also have some savings, and perhaps it's invest in the stock market or bonds or some form of investment that we expect a return on those savings. So that'll be another row for us, return on savings. And let's say those are only two sources of income. Now you can customize this for your situation and have however many sources of income you have, and whatever those are, make a row for each one. Those will be our two for this example, and below that we'll simply type a total for them. So a total income. That'll eventually just be the sum of our salary and return on savings. And that's our very simple income section. Now, of course, the next part in our budget would be our planned expenses. And so we'll give that a title as well. Just call it simply expenses. Most people have rent or mortgage. And so we will, in this case, we'll call it mortgage. That'll be our first expense here. Might also have a car payment. Now we could go more granular. In some cases you might keep it high level and perhaps represent multiple car payments if you have multiple car payments in one car payment line item, or you might split it out for the individual cars. You can be as granular with your budget as you want to be, as you find it to be useful. In this case, we'll keep it high level and say we only have one car payment, or maybe we have multiple and they're going to be represented in the same line. So one line for car payment. Similar concept for utilities. We'll summarize all of our budgeted utilities in one line item, but you might separate it out for power and gas and all of that. All right, we'll also have a line for groceries. We'll also make a line for other. Everybody needs an other bucket. No matter how granular you get, you probably can't account for every single line item. That would probably be too complex of a budget, so you're always going to need some form of an other category, I think. Now, here's the thing about Excel. We've plotted out a few different categories so far. Let's say we missed a few that we want to put ahead of mortgage. For this example, let's say that we want to insert a row for taxes and maybe a row for giving as well. Well, one way to do that is to simply shift cells down. And so I would go to the cell where I want to put a cell above it, right above mortgage here, and I would right click on that cell and then say insert. And in this case, I would want to shift the cells down one. And so I choose shift cells down. And now I have a new row here, and I can type taxes. So that's one way of doing that. Now I want to show you a different way, but in order to show you that way, I want to undo what I just did. Now this is where keyboard shortcuts can really save you some time. It's a good efficiency play to learn certain keyboard shortcuts, and there are a lot of them in Excel, but there's a few that I definitely recommend, and the one I'm about to tell you about applies not only to Excel, but almost any application you use. You can use it for Power BI and many other applications. So what I did is I just inserted a cell, moved everything down, and what I'd like to do is undo that change. And so in order to do that, I'm going to type on my keyboard. I'm going to first hit Control, hit Z, and then let go of both keys. Control Z, let go. And it undid the change. Really neat. Now if you wanted to redo that, maybe you said, no, I kind of like that, having that cell there. You can do Control Y, let go. So Control Z to undo and Control Y to redo. Now I'm going to undo that because I want to show you another way of shifting cells. This is my preferred method for inserting cells. A lot of times if you want to move everything down on a row, in this case there's only one column here, so either method would work. But if you wanted to insert a row above everything, like let's say we had other columns that were populated like that, what I would do is highlight that row. Just click over here in the margin to highlight the entire row. And similarly, if you wanted to do this from a column perspective, you can just click on a column. So if I click on a cell, it does not highlight the whole thing, but if I click on a letter or a row's number, it highlights the entire thing. Click on that number, right click on it, insert, and there you go. You have a row, an entire row insert into your Excel workbook. I'll delete these out. So we wanted to add a row for taxes. We also wanted to add a row. I'm going to add it right before mortgage. So I'm going to highlight row 11 that mortgage is on, right click, insert, and then type giving. Great. Well, that'll be our expenses for this example. And so at the bottom, I will also create a title for a total expenses row. Great. Well, we've got our salary, we've got our expenses. Now, one reason we might want to create this budget is because we'd like to plan out our savings goals. And so let's create another section for savings. So we'll start with the title savings, and the first thing we'll do is create a category or a line item for savings. What were our savings this year? There might be a better title for this, but we'll call it just simply savings. What were our savings for this year? And then below that, we will create another row for savings balance. And that's going to factor what our savings were at the beginning of that year, and after the savings we plan on having for the current year, what do we anticipate our new end of year savings balance to be? That's what the savings balance row is intended to represent. All right, so those are our categories for this example, and next we are going to get into parameterizing our Excel workbook, where we'll have some inputs that will then feed into the rest of our spreadsheet. Well, we've got a great start for our budget. We have laid out our categories, but now we want to potentially insert some parameters at the top of our Excel workbook that we can update, and then those updates would automatically flow through to the rest of our budget. In order to do that, similar to before, we need to make some space at the top of our Excel worksheet here. I'm going to click on income, and I'm going to create some room for parameters. So I right click on row 2, say insert cell. I'm going to insert another cell, and you can see it's a little repetitive what I'm doing. Now here's another method, and this works for whether you have blank cells like we have here and we want to create more blank cells, or if you have a particular section that's not blank and you want to copy it or cut it, you can highlight multiple rows, and likewise you can highlight multiple columns, highlight multiple rows, and I can copy all of those and then click on the row I want to insert them into, say insert copied cells. And similarly, if I were to highlight all of those and say cut, that is going to remove them from there. Once I insert them in a particular place, they are now removed. So that's the difference between copy and cut. I'm going to undo that by using the Control Z shortcut. And there's also actually some redo options and undo options here if you don't want to use the shortcut, keyboard shortcut. Now what we're going to do is do that with the blank rows here to create even more space. So I'm going to highlight all 4 of these blank rows. I'm going to right click on them, say copy, and then I'm going to highlight on row 5, right click, say insert copied cells. All right, now we're creating some space faster than just inserting rows one at a time. I might do that one more time. I'll probably create about 12 rows here at the top. Great, I've created some space. And now I want to lay out some parameters that are going to, high-level parameters that are going to impact our entire budget. I'm going to lay those out at the top of the code, or the worksheet. But this principle of laying out parameters at the top of our Excel workbook that then update everything else, it also applies to other analytics tools as well, like setting parameters in SQL or setting variables in Python, which we'll get into later on in this sessions. But let's set some parameters in Excel. So the first one we're going to set is our starting savings balance. Where were we at the beginning of the year? I'll make a row for that. We also need to set some kind of assumed interest rate or return rate. Rate of return would perhaps be a better word for it. Rate of return on savings. So I'll have a parameter for that. We also might want to make an assumption around salary growth. Certainly cannot be certain on what that's going to be, but we can make some reasonable assumptions, bake that into our model. We also need to consider what our tax rate is, and also what we have a line for giving. What's our giving going to be as a percentage of our income, so giving percentage. And we might want to think about for our expenses, we have an assumed salary growth. There could also, one reason why salaries generally increase is due to inflation, and that means our expenses might also go up. Certain expenses might go up over time, and so that can look different for each expense category, of course, but we will also try to bake in a general expense inflation rate as well, make some assumptions around that. So we have 6 different parameters that we're going to set at the top, so that if we want to make some assumptions and see how our budget would change if we experience a different inflation rate or a different rate of return on our savings, how that would impact our savings goals. All right, well, let's make some assumptions here. Let's say our starting savings balance is $50,000, and you can customize this as you wish. Let's say our rate of return on savings that we're going to assume for the next few years is, we'll say 4%. Adapt that to whatever your expectations are. Salary growth, 3% is a common number. Again, feel free to change these. Let's say that tax rate's going to depend on your income bracket, of course, but let's say our taxes, and this I guess would represent your national and state taxes, all of your anything applied to your income, including Social Security and those types of payroll taxes as well. Let's say it's 20% here, so we'll use that, and let's say we want to give 10% of our income, and let's set the inflation rate at say 4%. Feel free to adapt those as you wish. Now, what you'll notice here is all the cells are equal width. All the columns are equal width by default. But one problem with that is the default is cutting off some of our titles here. Even down here, it seems to, it naturally flows into the next cell, but if the next cell is populated, it'll get cut off as it is here with our starting savings balance. So one option would be to say, oh, I want to expand that and kind of do that manually as I am right there. But another option, probably a better option, a quicker option, is to simply double click on the right side of that column's letter at the top. So right here, you can see as soon as I hover on that edge, the mouse changes a little bit. I'm going to double click on the right edge of B in this case, and it automatically expands the column width to the longest number of characters in that particular column. In this case, it kind of managed to the rate of return of savings, and you can see added in a little extra there at the end, and you can adjust it from there if you wanted to manually. So that's a neat time saver, time trick. Now, I'm also noticing here that the alignment is a little different. So Excel by default aligned everything to the right, which is fine. In this case, I might want to align everything to the left. So I can do this one at a time by highlighting a cell and then clicking the align left button here. Or I can highlight multiple cells at the same time and apply this to everything. And now everything's left aligned. So it's a little more efficient, is to highlight all the cells that you want to apply an operation to. Another example of that, it's good to use highlighting, not too often, not for no purpose at all, but strategically. And in this case, I want to highlight the parameters that could be updated that will update the rest of the budget. And so in this case, those are all up here. And so I'm going to highlight all of these. I'm going to use the same color. Some people might use different colors for certain things. Feel free to use color however it makes sense for your use case. But in this case, we can highlight everything, and there's this fill color, represents the background color of the cell. By default, it's yellow, and you could choose other colors if you wanted to, but I will use yellow in this case, or I could have just clicked here. And there you go. We've got highlighting. If we wanted to remove that, you could go to no fill, but we will highlight our cells yellow. And at this point, one more thing I wanted to add in here. I wanted to add in a starting salary assumption. And so in order to do that, I will go ahead and click on row 4. I want to insert a row above this, similar to what we did before. Right click on row 4, insert, and I will add a starting salary assumption, and we'll set that at 50,000 for our example. All right, we've got some starting parameters. Let's go into the next step and actually build out our budget. Let's build out our year-by-year budget. Well, when we build our budget, the year part will not just apply to one section. It doesn't just apply to income or expenses or our savings down here. It applies to all of those categories. And so rather than put a year into each individual category like income and expenses, let's just create one year label, and we'll do that at the very top of our budget area here. And our first year we'll start with is year 2023. I'm going to go ahead and put that in there. That looks pretty good. I might go ahead and center it here. Now, in some cases, you perhaps if these have been drugged down, we might have a different format for it. And so if that does happen to you, you might right-click on the cell, and one of the options you'll have is to format cells. So notice, this is just a general format. You have currency. Obviously that wouldn't look good for a cell, but I can right click on it again and say maybe number, Sometimes you might see this and you might look at this and say, ooh, decimals for a year, that doesn't look right. Comma separator, which is generally a great thing to separate your larger numbers with a comma for every thousands, every three numbers. But doesn't make sense for a year. So right click on that, format cells, and we can either go back to general, or we could use number and just simply turn off the thousand separator and reduce the number of decimals. Again, default was fine in this case, but if you do see that, that's how you can adjust formatting. Another format that you can see up here is to turn it into a percentage. Obviously that's not what we want in this case, but those are some of the more popular formats that get used, and that's how to change it. Just right click on the cell. I'm going to do Control Z to undo that change. But that's our year. So we've gotten our year, we've centered it. Now we are going to want to build a budget where we can forecast our savings and our savings balance over time. We can actually do quite a bit of planning here. So let's say that we want to extend this out for several years. Well, I could set this up where I populate 2024, and then I'm using the arrow keys here, but I could also just double click or click on any of the cells 2025. I'm doing this manually, but there's a better way. So another way to approach this is to say, well, each column I populate is simply one more than the previous cell. That's a great use case for an Excel formula. So instead of doing this, what I'm going to do is type equals, and you can see that simply overwrites what was there before. And now I can actually point to another cell. This is the beauty of Excel. I can point to this cell and it says whatever is in this cell, that's what I want to start with. And if this cell ever changes, this cell is linked to it and it will change too. It'll always reference whatever the value is in that cell it's pointing to. And cells are referenced based on their letter, the letter of the column, and the number of the row. So in this case, it's saying equals C12. And you can simply click on the particular cell that you want to reference. You can see the reference is updating here. But you can also just simply type in that reference if you look at it and know that. So either way works. Now in this case, we don't want it to just equal 2023. If I want to edit this, I'm going to just double click on it and it brings up the equal C12. But we want it to be whatever that year was plus 1. Great. All right, so I will drag this across, just make several years here. Maybe we'll go through, let's say 2032. Now if we were said, how many years is that? A quick way to do that is to highlight. You can highlight columns, you can highlight rows, you can highlight combinations, a whole set of rows and columns. But one of the neat features here is that when you highlight rows, you get some summary statistics at the very bottom. This tells us the average among all populated values. The average here is 2028. Then it tells us the count. Now this is not the count of cells per se, but it's the count of cells with a value in it. So notice the count is currently 10. We have 10 rows represented here. What happens if I went further out? I'm highlighting more than 10 columns right now. Notice the count's still 10. That's because the count only count, and notice the average hasn't changed. It didn't factor these in as zeros or anything like that. The average, the count, the sum, they are all based on purely populated rows. So this is saying there are 10 cells that are populated. And among those 10 cells that are populated, the average is 2028. I'm going to highlight all of these, and again, similar to what we did over here with the highlighting and the justification, I'm going to, in one go, apply centering to all of them. Now in this case, I also want to have the same column width for all of those. I want to keep things as consistent as possible, and so I'm going to highlight all the columns up here, and then if I manually adjust the column width that I want, it is going to adjust all of the columns for each year so that they're all the same, whatever I've chosen I'm just editing column C here, but I have everything highlighted, and so it'll apply that formatting to everything. And now all the columns have the same width, which is a little more aesthetically pleasing than having different column widths. All right, so that is our year breakdown that applies to income, expenses, and savings. Now, another thing I want to do here is take this income section, and I might want to expand the title for this to go all the way across to all of our years. So I'm going to highlight the cell that income is currently in, and I'm going to highlight all of the columns that represent different years, highlight all of those. And this is where the merge and center option comes in. I'm just going to highlight those, come up here and click merge and center, and there you go. Now our income title goes all the way across all of our years. So that looks good. Now this is the title, and so I'm going to maybe apply some bold formatting to it to make that title stand out even more. I might also put a border around it. Now you could use underline, which would just simply underline that text. It doesn't go all the way across. In this case, rather than do an underline that only goes for income, I want to make it clear that this applies to all of the years. And so instead of, I'm gonna just click underline, which will de-underline it in this case, and then I'm going to apply a border to it. Now you have thin borders and you have thick borders. In this case, we'll use a thick border. There we go. That looks pretty good. We can do the same thing with expenses. That's another category label, and so we will highlight all the cells here, click merge and center, click bold, click border. There you go. It looks pretty similar. Now there's a faster way to do that. I'm going to do Control Z. You can do Control Z multiple times. That undid the border, that undid the bold, that undid the merge cells. I did Control Z 3 times there. Well, what if I said, well, I basically just want to do the same thing I just did to income. I want to apply that same formatting to expenses. One option for you, and this applies to a lot of scenarios, is to highlight the formatting that you want to apply. So I say, yeah, income looks great. If you could just take that formatting and apply it to expenses, would be great. Okay, highlight that. Click Format Painter here. And then you can see we change the border a little bit. It's kind of saying, okay, we're about to apply this formatting to whatever you click next. So after you click that Format Painter, the very next thing you need to do is click into the cell that you want to apply that formatting to. And it's the expenses cell right here. So watch what happens after I clicked Format Painter and then I click expenses. There you go. All three of those things, the merge cells, the bold, the border, it's all been applied. And so why not do that again? We can actually do it from expenses this time, or income. We're going to click on that formatting that we like, click Format Painter, click on Savings. There we go. We've quickly created some similar formatting for each of our labels. And I might put some bold on all of the years by highlighting all of them, just trying to be as efficient as possible. It's taking shape. Well, let's try to populate our first line item here, which is salary. Now our starting salary, we could just go in and say, oh, it's going to be 50,000. But we created a parameter up here for a reason. We want to simply be able to point to the starting salary up here and be able to update at the top of our workbook and then let that flow into the budget from there. So rather than what this would be called hard coding down here, we have typed in specifically 50,000, and so if we update this to be 45,000, for instance, it doesn't change here. Well, we want to be able to just change these parameters up here and have everything flow through. So instead of hard coding it here and typing the specific number, we're going to use the equal sign and point to the cell C4. In this case, we can click on it. Great. Now watch what happens if we update this to 45,000. The cell updates too. Pretty neat. Very similar to what we did here, except in this case, we're just simply pointing to that value. We're not adding one like we did for the year. All right, so let's change this back to 50,000. Cell changes. Great. 2023 is really easy. Now in 2024, again, we have assumed that we will have a salary growth each year of 3%. So an easy way of calculating that would be to say, well, what was your salary last time? We'll point to 2023 salary, and then maybe we multiply by 1.03. You get your salary last year plus 3% in the next year, 2024. That's our assumption. And that would, oh, notice what happened here. It does this hashtags, multiple hashtags. It says there's not enough room to display this. Now there's a couple ways of handling this. One would be to expand it by going up to the column letter, double clicking on the right edge. There you go, it expands it. We can see all the numbers now. So what it did here was it actually put in some decimals here, which you don't want to show decimals unless it's really necessary. We're talking about something like a salary, especially one in the thousands. Probably don't need to see the cents there. It's just too much information. We want to simplify it a little more. And so one way of doing that would be to right click on it and say format cells. Okay, reduce the number of decimal places. And there you go, we're back to where we were before. And now we might want to update our cell headers. I'll just update that there. Okay, looks good. We did inadvertently though, we did some hard coding. Sure, our salary will update if we update 45,000, great. But if we update the salary growth to be, say, 2%, this doesn't change. Why? Because we've hard-coded this salary increase of 1.03 down here. So we want that to be dynamic and to reference this salary growth assumption up here as well. Do Control-Z to undo those. Okay, 50,000, 3%. So now instead of doing that, what we can do here, the multiplication sign, by the way, is this star. That's what's used for multiplication in Excel formulas. Well, I'm going to delete this 1.03. So we need it to be 1, because that represents what our baseline was, plus this 3%. So instead of putting 0.03 there, we're simply going to point to the salary growth row. And then we'll do close. So parentheses here, we need this 1 plus 0.03 in this case to be calculated before doing the multiplication. So we're using parentheses to handle the order of operations. All right, that should be good. Looks good. Now, if we update our salary growth to be a little bit lower, this number changes. So everything, and if this changes as well, similar to last time, it changes. So our salary numbers here are truly dynamically changing based on these parameters that are set at the top. That's what we want. All right, well, I guess at this point, similar to year, we can simply drag this. This is neat. You can, one way of doing this would be to right click and say copy, paste, and then maybe right click again and say copy, paste, and just kind of keep doing that. Now there is a keyboard shortcut. We can highlight something, Control C, and then you can paste it by using Control V. That's another good shortcut that works on a lot of different platforms. So either way, whether you right click on it and then right click on the cell you want to paste it in and say paste, either way we're copying, right? Now there is a quicker way to expand this though. In this case we want to do that all the way across for 8 or 9 different cells here. What you can do in Excel is simply click on the cell that you want to copy over, and you notice the cursor changes a little bit when you go to the bottom right of that cell. That's good. You want to go to the bottom right of the cell, do a left click, and then drag. You can use this to drag down or to drag to the right or left or up. So we're going to drag to the right in this case. The whole thing is copied. Great. Now this is where a good sanity check comes in. We look at it and we say, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't look right. we're not seeing that 3% growth being applied to 2025 and beyond. It looks great for 2024, but what about 2025? One thing I like about Excel is if you double click into a cell, it'll highlight with colors what cells it's pointing to. So we can easily see, okay, it's pointing to the previous year times 1 plus 3%. That looks great. Well, what happened in 2025? Let's double click there. Okay, pointing to 51,500 from 2024. That makes sense. 1 plus D5. Wait a minute. That's blank. I don't want it to point to D5. I want it to point to C5. This is where locking cells comes in. So a way to, before we drag the formula over, in some cases, maybe you did have a different assumption for 2024. So maybe you said, yeah, 2024 salary growth there, I'm thinking 4%, and then maybe 2% after that. I'm gonna, get promoted in 2026, and then, I'm gonna do 3% after that, and now you actually have dynamic, a different salary growth for each year. So maybe you have some assumptions around this, and this is a good model for you. But in our assumption, we're going to have a simple assumption that just on average, your salary growth is 3%. Okay. So in that case, we need to lock cells. So let's go into, before we drag in this, I'm going to highlight this and just click the delete button. That'll remove everything. Before I drag the formula, I need to lock any of the cells that I want to. Now, the 50,000 here, we do want that to always be the cell to the left. So that looked great. There's no locking necessary there. But we do for C5 here, you can lock the number, which would represent the row, or you can lock the column. In this case, it's shifting the column as we drag the formula to other columns. So we need to lock in the formula. We need to say we always want it to be column C, even if we've drug over to other columns. So let's do that. To do that, to lock either a column or a row, you simply put a $sign. And you can do that before the column, which locks in the column. And if you wanted to lock the row, you can do one or the other or both. You can put a $sign before the row number. In this case, we just want to lock in the column number C. So we've done that. We put the $sign in there. Watch what happens now when we go to the bottom right of the cell, drag it over. Okay, it's looking a little better. And we can see why if we double click, I'll double click on a different cell this time, it's still referencing the 3%. It doesn't keep shifting to the right because we put that $sign there. Now we wanted it to reference the most recent salary. We wanted that to kind of dynamically shift. If we go to 2030, it's referencing 2029. And so we didn't put the $sign in front of that so that it would drag over with it. Hopefully that does a good job of illustrating the difference there between locking formulas and not locking formulas. All right, we've got our salary populated. Now let's populate our return on savings that we expect for the next several years. We'll start with the first cell, and I'm going to go ahead and double click in there. Now this first cell is unique because we're not going to be referencing any kind of ending savings balance at the bottom of the sheet that would have been calculated. We will reference, at least for this first 2023 return on savings, what our starting savings balance was, the parameter that we enter at the top. So reference that, and then we're going to multiply that by our expected rate of return on savings, which is the 4% here. All dynamically, so that if we update these later, it'll automatically update for our return on savings row. There we go, expecting $2,000 return, 4% of the $50,000 in 2023. Now for 2024 and beyond, our return on savings will be a function of not the starting savings balance for 2023, but whatever our ending savings balance was from the prior year, which will be represented in this row eventually. So we're going to point to prior year, 2023, C34 in this case, and we're going to multiply that by our rate of return on savings. Now let's not make the same mistake we did last time, where we calculate that, we drag it over, and notice unless we wanted to populate a unique rate of return on savings for every single year, we need to lock in at least the rate of return on savings. Now, similar to what happened with salary, we do always want it to be based on the most recent year's ending savings balance. So this part, K34 column, row 34 is fine here, but we need to come in here and lock in the cell reference. Now remember, before we manually kind of hit the dollar sign to lock in the reference to column C. Another way of doing that is using, again, keyboard shortcut. If you're selected, if I'm right before C, or even here, like right before the 3, if I just hit F4, I can actually hit it multiple times, and it's going to cycle through the different combinations, locking through the column, locking in the row, or locking in both like it is right here. So that's a quick way to lock in a reference, is to highlight that, click F4. So we've done that. Now when I drag over to the right, still referencing the 4%. Now it's still 0 because we haven't populated our ending savings balance, but we will do that soon enough, and we should see these numbers update. Now they're not formatted as dollars, and they probably should be. We would want that return on savings to be in dollars. Again, we could right click on it, go into format cells, go into currency, choose this format, and do that for each one without the decimals, or use that convenient format painter option to copy the formatting to all of those cells. I'm going to highlight this row, which has the exact format we want it to be in, dollar sign in front, no decimals. Click the format painter, and it's very important that you click in the first cell where you want the copying to start, which would be for us C17 here. And there you go, we've got it updated. Now maybe we go ahead and do that for our next row, total income, which we'd also want to be in dollars with no decimal sign. Let's do that. We also would want, let's center this. So we'll do center. Some people might prefer left align, some centering. We'll center for now. Now we're wanting to do a sum of salary and return on savings to get our total income. And a very simple way to do that would be to say equals this cell, 50,000, plus the 2,000, the return on savings, and that gets us our total. So we're simply typing in a formula, and you can see we used a plus sign. Makes sense. We could use minus. We saw that you could use the star sign if you wanted to multiply, but we want to add here. That's certainly a valid way to do that. Let's see, like this. Another way though, and this will really pay off when we do our total expense calculation, is to use a function. Now functions are big in any analytics platform. They do things, and like in the one we're going to use, sum, they allow us to aggregate across multiple things, but functions do all kinds of things. In this case, instead of doing that sum operation, we'll still start off with an equal sign, but we're going to refer to a function name, and that function is going to be called sum. And a function in a lot of platforms, but in Excel in particular, starts with a function name, open parentheses, and then as you can see here, it'll take a set of arguments. For sum, the arguments are simply the cells that you want to add up. So in one case, we have the salary, 50,000. We want to use a comma, and we want to enter all the other things that we want to sum. In this case, the 2,000 as well. We can do that. We can close parentheses that ends the function, and press enter. And now that's another way of calculating a sum. Instead of using the plus sign, we used a function name called sum that adds the cells that are separated by commas. Now again, in the expense case, this is really going to come in handy. Rather than individually selecting all of those, In Excel, what we can do is actually highlight the cells in a range. So in this case, it'd just be 2, but you could do however many cells that you needed to add. You can just highlight them all. And notice what happens here in our formula. You end up with a colon that shows from this cell to this cell, we want to select all of those. So same sum function we were using before when we used commas, but now we're using colons, a colon to select a range of cells. So that's a especially efficient way to calculate a sum. We do that. See what happens when we go to the bottom right of the cell, drag over. Looks good. I'm going to double click here. Yep, it scrolls over and adds the salary and the return on savings for that row. Now, in accounting and even in math itself, we often use an underline to denote a sum. And so let's do that in this case and make it very clear that salary and return on savings are being added to get to our total sum. And I could just go to a particular cell and highlight this border option. You can do a thick border or a thin border, but if you wanted to do it across all the cells, we can highlight all of these cells, go back to our border option, bottom border, and look at that. It's very clear that salary and return on savings are being added to get to total income. Hey, our income section is looking really good. It's time to go down to our expenses section, and we're going to start that with a calculated column of taxes. Now, taxes would simply be equal to salary. We want it to be dynamic, so we're going to reference the salary row here, and then multiply that by our parameter, which is tax rate. And we're not going to make the same mistake we did before of not locking in our cell for the tax rate, so I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut F4 to lock it in, and there's our taxes for 2023. We'll take this formula, go to the bottom right, we want to drag it over. We'll just see some examples here. Okay, this is taking our new salary for 2024, multiplying by the same 20% tax rate. Now, in practice, as your income goes up, usually your tax rate would go up as well, depending on the country you're in. But we would scroll that over, and you can see what's really neat about this is now we're able to forecast what our taxes will be based on a forecasted salary based on an assumed salary growth. We have a lot of things that are linked together here, which is pretty neat. It's pretty neat functionality that Excel has in that way. All right, so we've calculated our taxes. Now, giving, that was going to be the salary times our giving percentage as well, 10%. Let's multiply that out and lock in the giving rate for the parameter that we've set in cell C7. There we go. Drag that across as well. All right. Now both of these are annual figures because they're referencing an annual salary. Our mortgage or our rent, usually the way we think about that is from a monthly basis. Now we could go ahead and put a particular mortgage value here. So I'm thinking, you know, let's use a value of $1,200 per month. But our values here are actually annual values, so we would need to adjust that. And you could potentially use a calculator or hard code in what 1,200 times 12 is and put that value here. I find that if a lot of people are going to think about something like a mortgage from a monthly basis, doing the calculation at an annual level, it's probably more intuitive if someone were to click into the cell to say equals the more intuitive value, a monthly rate of 1,200 times 12. That'll be way more intuitive than just taking the result of that and just hard coding in whatever that equals. You know, putting equals 14,400 in here. Folks might think, well, how'd you get that? Hopefully it's clear that that's the mortgage for 2023, but I think even more intuitive would be to have the formula here that they can click into and say, oh yeah, 1,200 mortgage a month times 12 months makes sense. Now, what we'll assume here is that the inflation doesn't impact this. We'll make that assumption that the mortgage is kind of locked in for the next 10 years. And that makes the rest of the formula really easy. It's just going to always equal this cell. And if we drag that over, it's always going to equal the preceding cell. We're not adding anything to it, so it stays constant across all of the years. That's our assumption. Now we've kind of hard-coded, at least for this first cell, our mortgage rate. Maybe it makes sense to actually bake in some parameters at the top for some of these expenses, like what our mortgage is. That way we don't have to hunt down that row and update it here. It'll just be easier to have all of our inputted parameters at the top. So I might go ahead and do that. I'm going to say mortgage, and then I'll just take this exact formula, I'm going to copy it, paste it in here, using Control-C to copy this, Control-V to paste it. I'm going to copy the formatting over, so click on this dollar formatting with no decimals, take that format painter, apply it there. Okay, that's looking better. And then I will left align that. Now we're probably going to need to do the same thing with car payment, utilities, with groceries, with other. I'm just going to go ahead and make all of those parameters at the top so we can, focus on making updates at the top, and then everything down here is going to be calculated. I think that'll be a nice way to set it up. So I'm copying over those categories. Let's see, car payment, similar to mortgage. A lot of people think about that from a monthly basis as well. So we're going to set that to be a monthly value. In fact, let's go ahead and set our make this a monthly mortgage. So we use the 1200 here, and then we'll actually apply the annualizing of it in the spreadsheet below, the cells below. So we'll taking that monthly mortgage, multiplying by 12. Now car payment, this is an interesting one. Car payment, I don't know if you can expect a car to be reliable for 10 years. Maybe in some cases you can, but there could be some inflation, and so at a certain point, really your cash flow model might look more like at a certain point you expect to buy a new car, and then that has an impact on your car payment. Let's say that they're taking into account trade-in values and inflation and all of that. Let's just apply our inflation rate to the car payment just to create a little bit of a simpler model. And so in that sense, this won't just be a consistent car payment, it'll be our starting car payment, and we'll assume that utilities are impacted by the inflation rate as well. So we'll call this starting utilities. Same thing with groceries, starting groceries. So this is all of these are value that we expect for 2023, and starting other category for expenses that don't fit into the ones we've been specific about. All right, so we'll say $300 for our starting car payment. Let's just say starting utilities, $300. We'll say our starting groceries are $300, and we'll say our other bucket is $300 as well for starters. I'm going to left align all of these and want to be consistent. I'm going to call out anything that's a inputted parameter, and I'm going to highlight it in yellow here. All right, back down here, we're going to point to our starting car payment here, starting utilities here, starting groceries. By the way, since all of these things are in the same order, I could just drag this down. Now, again, I forgot, something looks off here, applied some sanity checks and realized, okay, car payment, $300 for 2023, probably need to multiply that by 12 since that's our monthly value. And same thing for all of these values. So this gets the starting other, which is a monthly value, multiplies it by 12. And I should probably specify, it's good to be very clear about what something represents. I'm going to specify that these are all monthly values. Now notice, now we need to widen this column, and the easy way to do that, double click on the right side of that column. There you go, stretches it out for us again. Looking good for 2023. Now remember, our car payment and utilities and groceries and other, it's not going to be as simple as mortgage where it's consistent for the next 10 years. We are going to assume some inflation, so it's going to be really similar to what we did with our salary, where he said take the prior year and add a certain percentage, 1 plus a certain percentage. In this case, it's a percentage that represents how much we think our expenses are going to increase year over year. So it wouldn't be a bad idea to maybe do Control C to copy this, or right click on it and say copy, paste it here. Let's just double click and see what the formula is referring to. Okay, it's referring to the prior cell, and this thing is moved, which is kind of expected, but we want to go ahead and take that and apply it to the inflation rate. So we're going to do the previous car payment 1 plus the inflation rate. You know, I'm going to do a dollar sign in front of everything in this case, so that when we drag it down, it keeps it on the inflation rate as well. And when we drag it to the right, it also stays on the same 4% inflation. Drag that to the right. Okay, just double click, make sure, yep, 2032 is taking 2031's car payment and adding 4% to it. Looks good. Let's just drag this down for all of our expenses and see how that looks. Okay, other category for 2023, still 1 plus 4% because we locked the letter and the number, the column and the row, using the dollar sign. That's looking really good. I'm going to highlight all three of these, drag them all over. So you can highlight multiple rows and drag them over at the same time. Really neat functionality here. And as you can see, since our starting monthly car payment, utilities, groceries, other, everything's $300, everything is consistent here. And we have, it looks like, updated all of our expenses, which is great. Now we're ready to do something very similar to what we did for income. In fact, maybe I'll just go ahead and copy this sum formula down here. But notice that it's only going to capture the 2 cells above. We can actually just go in here and easily stretch it out so that now it's going from cell C26 to C32, adding all of those up. And I'll just go ahead and take that new formula that captures all of the rows, drag that over to the right. Great, looking good. Now we had this bar to denote the fact that we were summing up all of these line items to get to our total income. We'll do the same thing for our total expenses. I'm going to highlight these 2 rows since the underscore is kind of between them in this case. It doesn't hurt anything. I'm going to do Format Painter, and I'm going to paste it in the same area that I want that line to be applied. Looking good. And I'll also center these to be consistent with the income section. So everything is centered. All right, looking great so far. We've got one more section down here, our savings section. Savings is very simple calculation. It is your income for that year minus your total expenses for that year. This would suggest that we're going to save $8,200 in the first year, and we can drag that over. Wow, and see a forecast of how much we're going to save each year. Well, that's nice to see. And a next question we might have is, well, if we're going to save that much each year, what would our final savings be? And what would the savings be at each point, after each year? So our starting savings balance, or ending savings balance for 2023, this one will be unique because it's the first year we're looking at. We're going to come up here and point to our starting savings balance so that if that needs to be updated, we can, and it'll flow through. But we're going to take that starting savings balance for 2023 and we'll add the amount of savings we got in 2023, 8,200, but we'll reference it dynamically. We're not going to hard code 8,200. And there we have our ending savings balance for 2023. Now, if we were to drag this over, it'll still be referencing the cells up here. So we're going to, for 2024 and beyond, perform a different calculation to calculate our savings balance. Our savings balance will simply be what was your ending savings balance for the previous year, add to that whatever your savings is for that year, and that will be your new ending savings balance for 2024. And at this point, we can simply drag it over. This is, I guess it's a good thing. We've got some large numbers here, and in order to adjust for that, we can maybe double click here. Yep, everything's kind of been adjusted. Now these cells are a little bit larger than these cells. I want to kind of keep it consistent, so I'm going to highlight all of the columns and then just make a slight adjustment there so that everything, all the years, end up having the same width. We have a little more width for the first column, which I think is fine. I'm going to center these. It's looking good. Well, something I might do here is highlight this section in bold, or put the totals in bold. So I'm going to highlight that entire row, click on bold. Same thing here, bold, bold. Now there is a calculation. I guess there's a calculation happening with both of these. So I don't know. Yeah, savings balance is kind of what we're really trying to monitor, so I'll go ahead and put that there, and I might even put an underline here since there's some calculations being happening there. All right, so we are actually able to use this forecasting model, and based on our assumptions at least, we can kind of estimate what our savings balance would be after any year in the next 10 years. And of course, we could go further out than that. So I'll zoom out a little bit so we can maybe get a final snapshot of what our model looks like. Might even consider moving some of this over here so we don't have as much space, but yeah, we've got our starting savings balance that can be updated, rate of return, salary, growth rate, tax rate, giving percentage, and inflation rate, our expense assumptions, and all of that flows through this model. Nothing is hard-coded down here, which is really neat. It means you can make all of your updates to assumptions up here. And so if we say, well, what if my starting salary was $60,000? What does that do? Imagine trying to calculate this by hand, starting with a salary of $50,000, and then for some reason you make an adjustment and you've calculated all of it and you forecast it out to 2032, and you say, yep, I should have, I'm expecting to have savings of going from 50,000 currently to 173,000 in 10 years, and then you say, oh, I messed something. I should have used a different inflation rate or a different starting salary, or you just wanted to see what it would be with a different salary. This allows you to simply update that cell, and now you can see, wow, if I go from 50,000 to 60,000 as my current starting salary, my savings goes up from 170 or 80,000 like it was before to about 270,000 instead 10 years from now. So cool that you just simply update one cell and everything else updates. So I hope you've gotten a lot out of this. I hope you can use this in your personal life. And if you really want to make this a little more actionable, if you think about it, this will be your homework assignment. I'll give you a preview into it now. If you think about it, people probably want to monitor how they're doing against their budget, what they've planned out on a more frequent basis than annually. Monthly might be a more regular cadence. So what I'd like for you to do is consider this as your annual budget. Let's right click and rename it annual budget. Now I'd like for you to create your own monthly budget. So you might create another tab here, rename it monthly budget. Again, if you want to turn off grid lines like I do, you can just go to view and turn off grid lines. But think about taking this, perhaps linking to this so it uses the same assumptions, but perhaps you take the annual number here, divide it by 12, or you could get more specific about how you want to divide it by month, but create something that maybe has a column for every month. And also think about not just planning, But can you create a way where you can enter what your actuals were, line by line, so that you can monitor and see, okay, here's what I expected for my other category, here's what it actually was, here's the difference. And ultimately, if you're not, maybe you're exceeding what you planned from a savings perspective, maybe you haven't saved as much as you planned, you can look line by line item to see what's contributing to that difference from plan the most, and really allow you to adjust from there. And that's our personal finance use case. I hope you enjoyed it.